In the quiet town of Meadow-Ridge, where life moved at a gentle pace, Martha Harper lived alone in a quaint house at the edge of town. Her home was charming but somber, much like the woman herself. Once filled with laughter and love, her life had grown quiet since the passing of her husband George 3 years ago. Martha, now in her early 60s, spent her days tending to small tasks and her evenings staring at old photographs. Her garden, which George had once loved, had become overgrown with weeds, its beauty fading with her enthusiasm for life. Meanwhile, across town, Henry Reeves, a kind but reserved gardener in his late 50s, had noticed the house on his way to work. He often passed by while cycling to his clients, the garden's neglect catching his eye. But it wasn't the garden that truly held his attention. It was the solitary figure of Martha, sitting by the window, looking out with a sadness that tugged at his heart. Henry didn't know Martha personally, but he'd heard of her loss. Something about her quiet sorrow resonated with him. A widower himself, he understood the ache of missing someone so deeply that it felt like part of you was missing. One morning, as he cycled past her house, an idea struck him. He didn't know why or how, but he felt compelled to do something, even if it was small. That evening, under the cover of dusk, Henry returned to Martha's house. With a spade in one hand and a young rosebush in the other, he quietly stepped into her garden. The air was still, and the only sound was the distant chirping of crickets. Henry found a bare patch of soil near the garden path and planted the rosebush. It was a simple yellow rose, bright and cheerful. He worked quickly, careful not to disturb the house, and left without a trace. The next morning, when Martha stepped outside to fetch her mail, she stopped in her tracks. The yellow rose caught her eye immediately, its petals glowing in the sunlight. A flicker of curiosity stirred within her. She couldn't remember planting it, but something about the vibrant flower made her smile. Something she hadn't done in a long time. Encouraged by the small but visible change, Henry continued his secret mission. Every evening he planted another rosebush, each a different color, red for love, white for purity, pink for gratitude. Martha noticed the garden transforming before her eyes. Each morning brought a new surprise, and each new rose seemed to breathe life back into her spirit. She found herself stepping outside more often, pulling weeds, and even watering the flowers. Though she didn't know who was behind the gesture, Martha felt a sense of companionship. It was as if someone out there cared, even if they remained unseen. One day, as Henry planted a deep orange rosebush near the garden gate, he heard the creak of a door. He froze, heart pounding, as Martha stepped outside. "Who's there?" she called, her voice firm but not unkind. Henry, caught red-handed, straightened up slowly. "It's just me," he said softly, holding up his hands. Martha stared at him, recognition dawning. "You're the gardener who passes by every morning, aren't you?" Henry nodded, looking sheepish. "I didn't mean to intrude. I noticed your garden and it looked like it needed a little love. I hope I didn't overstep." Martha's initial surprise melted into gratitude. She studied the man before her, his kind eyes, weathered hands, and the genuine sincerity in his expression. "You're the one who's been planting the roses?" she asked, her voice tinged with emotion. "Yes," Henry admitted. "I thought it might bring you some happiness." Martha smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "It has. More than you know." From that day on, Henry didn't have to sneak into Martha's garden. Instead, they worked on it together. Every evening, Henry would bring a new rosebush and they'd plant it side by side. They shared stories. Of George, of Henry's late wife, of the lives they'd lived and the people they'd loved. The garden blossomed under their care, becoming a kaleidoscope of color and fragrance. But more importantly, something else began to bloom between them. Martha found herself looking forward to their time together. Henry's quiet strength and gentle humor brought light into her life, and Henry, who had spent years keeping to himself, felt his heart stir in ways he thought were long gone. One summer evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the garden glowed in the golden light, Henry turned to Martha. "You know," he began hesitantly, When I started planting those roses, I didn't expect anything in return. But this garden, it's given me more than I could have imagined." Martha looked at him, her eyes soft and filled with gratitude. "It's not just the garden, Henry. It's you. You've brought life back into this house, and into me." Henry reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers. "Maybe we've been planting more than roses." Martha smiled, her heart full for the first time in years. From then on, the garden became not just a symbol of their shared loss, but of their new beginning. Together, they tended to it, watching as it flourished, just as their lives did, intertwined like the roots of the roses they had planted together.